Då är det dags att fortsätta Konsumentskyddsdagen 2015. Och medan ni har fikat i lugn och ro så har det varit en del dramatik här, för att det var en del teknik som får Melodifestivalen att framstå som en baggis. Men vi har fixat det. Så vi har USA med oss på länk. Och jag ger ordet till Robert Östling som är verksam vid Stockholms universitet och dessutom sitter i Konsumentverkets vetenskapliga råd. Och ett tema idag har ju varit att vi inte varit sig så pålästa eller rationella, och det är på något sätt det du ska prata om också, eller hur?
Ja, precis. Eller det vi tänkte låta Richard prata om. Så att, politiskt beslutsfattande har präglats mycket av en bild av konsumenten, har präglats traditionellt av bilden av människor som rationella och välinformerade. Den här bilden har också dominerat den akademiska disciplinen nationalekonomi. Men sen 70-talet då så har beteendeekonomi eller behavioral economics växt fram. Där Richard Taylor då är en av förgrundsgestalterna som i hög grad ifrågasätter den bilden av människan som rationell och välinformerad. So on that note, I would like to introduce to you Professor Richard Taylor from the Chicago Booth School in Graduate School of Business. Is that the name for it? So I could spend a long time introducing Richard Taylor. I mean, he's a world-leading economist. If you look at a list on people that people think might get the economics prize in memory of Alfred Nobel, you will recurringly see his name. He's one of the founding fathers of behavioral economics. He's currently the president of the American Economic Association. And personally for me, I mean, I'm a student of behavioral economics, so I'm delighted to be here and honored to be here to discuss this new book with Richard Taylor. I remember especially as a student when I was writing my master's thesis, and I was thinking about making up your mind about moral decisions. Actually whether I should become a vegetarian or not. And I remember especially, I mean, I read several of Professor Taylor's papers, but I remember especially one of his papers, which was from the early 80s, and I discovered, it took 20 years for me to discover it, but I was hardly born when it was written, so perhaps I'm excused, but I was so happy when I discovered that there are actually economists that think like me, right? So this is a model that you consist of two selves that are struggling between each other to make decisions for you. Okay, so Richard Taylor, he's coming out with a new book. So I don't have the book. Yeah, it's in my phone, right? But I've read it. It was published yesterday. And this book, I mean, it gives a personal account of the history of behavioral economics as a discipline. But it's kind of also your academic autobiography, in a sense, describing your experiences as an economist. So you might be confused about the title, misbehaving. So who's misbehaving? So I think there's like misbehaving on different levels. So one is consumers that are not behaving just like the economic theories say they should behave. I think it also perhaps refers to the discipline of behavioral economics, right? That it's a discipline or sub-discipline that didn't quite behave as the other economists. And perhaps it applies also to Richard Taylor personally. I don't know whether you didn't behave like all the other economists, perhaps. Okay, so let's start. There are some 250 people in this audience with mixed backgrounds. So can you start out by telling what is behavioral economics? And in what sense, if it is it a misbehaving discipline?
It turns out that this room seems to have a light switch that automatically turns off. So I'll have to move occasionally.
That's great.
Or I will get into the dark. So, you're right that the title of the book is meant to describe both the field and myself. So, as you know, economic theory is based on the assumption that human beings are very rational decision makers who have no trouble comparing 6 complicated mortgages and deciding which is best for them, and have no trouble deciding how much they need to save for retirement, and have no trouble then implementing that plan since they have no self-control problems. So the people I know misbehave relative to that model. They don't behave the way economists think they should. And you're right that by pointing that out, certainly the early part of my career, I was thought to be misbehaving. My thesis advisor told me to go back to doing serious work.
You're not really misbehaving if you become the president of the American Economic Association, I guess. You did something right.
Yeah, well, that's a very long lag. You know, I have a lot of gray hair here.
Great. So, in recent years, I mean, you have become very famous for a book you wrote a couple of years ago with Cass Sunstein called Nudge, right? And you describe in the book how you came across the word nudge and how you come to write. I mean, it was really a global bestseller that almost everybody knows about. You say in the book that there are now, I think, 51 countries where central government initiatives have been taken inspired by Nudge, your book essentially, where we're trying to create better policies using behavioral science and behavioral economics. So I think most people here have heard about nudges, but in your own words, what is a nudge? So can you remind the audience what it is?
Well, and we define a nudge as any small feature of the environment that attracts our attention and influences our behavior. Both in that book and in my current book, I use the term humans and econs to distinguish between the people that we interact with and the people economists think they are studying. And econs would not be affected by nudges, but humans are. Probably the most famous nudge is the one at the Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, where some genius got the idea to etch the image of a housefly in the urinals near the drain in order to induce the men to have better aim. And at least the airport authorities claim that this nudge reduced spillage, which is their term, by 80%. So I like that example of a nudge, not only because it's amusing, but because that fly has become sort of my metaphor for what a nudge is. So, you know, econs wouldn't need it, but humans sometimes get distracted.
Right. So a nudge is something that really, doesn't, subtly pushes you in a certain direction. It's not like a ban or like a tax on something, right? It's
right. So
and it's also on the other side. It's not just information. It's not like an information brochure. You should use the urinal in this particular way, for example.
Well, information brochure could be a nudge, probably not a very good one, and to some extent, an information brochure would work on econs. If they don't have the information, then providing it would help. But, think of instruction manuals. Those are basically useless for humans and perfectly adequate for econs. And, Apple has become the most valuable company in the world essentially by inventing devices that don't need instruction manuals. So, and I should say about nudging that Cass and I don't think that you can solve all of the world's problems with nudges. The goal of the book was kind of an exercise, kind of like tying one hand behind your back and saying, how much could you succeed if you limit yourself to no bans and mandates? Now, of course, you will want to ban some things like fraud, and you might want to mandate some things. Many countries have some kind of required retirement saving plan. So and most countries have mandatory schooling for children. But the idea is that you can accomplish many things without resorting to bans and mandates, and we wanted to explore how you would go about doing that. And the way you do it is using another term we coined in that book, which is choice architecture. And the idea is that whoever designs the environment in which people choose has influence over the behavior of the people who interact in that environment. And often they will not even realize that they're having that influence. So if you go to a restaurant, the chef decides what he or she is going to cook, but there's somebody at the restaurant who creates a menu. And you can organize menus in lots of ways. Fish and meat and in different categories. In an Italian restaurant is pasta in a different category. And then what order within categories are the things arranged? In economic theory, all of those things are what in my new book I call supposedly irrelevant factors. So economists make very strong predictions about many things, which is that they will have absolutely no effect on anyone. Like that fly in the urinal. That's a supposedly irrelevant factor. And essentially, my career has been studying supposedly irrelevant factors and finding that they matter.
So one such supposedly relevant factor is default options. And one program that I think, one particular nudge that has been very successful and that you designed is a Save More Tomorrow savings program. And as a way to increase how much people save for retirement, which is a great policy concern in the US. So can you tell us, I don't think everybody here has heard about the Save More Tomorrow program. So what is that and why is it a successful nudge?
So the idea is that many people, well, I should say, in talking about default options in that domain, we should start with automatic enrollment, since that's really changing the default. And that changing default options we see in almost every domain has huge effects. Again, huge effects that economic theory would predict would have exactly zero. So you have a pension plan. In the US, the employer often matches contributions. Every econ would join such a plan because they're getting an immediate 50 or 100% return on their money just by joining, but many don't. If you automatically enroll them, then almost everyone does. The UK has just launched a large national individual savings plan using automatic enrollment, and the opt-out rate is about 10%. But the problem with automatic enrollment is that the initial saving rate is often too low. And so Save More Tomorrow is designed to solve that problem. And it can be the default or not. It works better if it's the default. But if it's not, you can invite people to sign up for a program where their savings are increased every year, ideally whenever they get a raise, but it doesn't have to be that way. And we found that this program is immensely successful. In the first company that we finally got to adopt it, we tripled saving rates in 2.5 years. And it works because of inertia, one of the most powerful forces of human nature. It's why you sometimes find yourself watching a show you have no interest in just because it came on after one that you were watching by choice. And so we put that to work for us. And yeah, that program is now available in about half of the large firms in the US.
About half of the large firms. Wow. Great. So I think in Sweden we have a mandatory, I mean, a large fraction of pension savings have been mandatory, at least historically, but they still are. And I think, so the worry here is often not so much that people save too little for retirement, but more how they manage their long-term investments. So, for example, many economists were worried that people buy expensive actively managed mutual funds instead of cheap index funds. And economists also were worried that people tend to buy a too small fraction of stocks in the total portfolio. So I want us to discuss for a while, ways in which we can potentially get consumers to make better long-term financial decisions. So you've previously written about the Swedish part privatization of the PPM reform in Sweden, which took place in year 2000. So what do you? So what's your take on that? I mean, here this is something that people for sure are familiar with, because everybody remembers, I think, the campaign in connection with this reform, where everybody was encouraged to make active decisions, right, and not to choose the default.
So yeah, I studied this with one of my graduate students, a Swedish guy called Henrik Gronqvist, and I think that the design of that plan, there were many good features, but two bad ones. So one was essentially any fund could get in, and so when it started there were over 500 funds, and the last time I looked it was over 800. It's probably over 1,000 now. It's preposterous to think that people can look at an assortment of 500 mutual funds and do a satisfactory job of picking among them. And now something very smart was there was a default fund that was created by experts, and as far as I could tell, on an ex-ante basis, that fund was terrific. I would have been happy to invest in that fund. I still would. Very low fees, global diversification. But then somebody decided, no, people shouldn't choose that fund. They should pick their own. And the paper Henrik and I wrote showed that the people who took the default fund were better off ex ante. I mean, they were better diversified, they had lower fees, and ex post they were better off because the choices that people made on their own were, not surprisingly, not very good. The fund that got the most money was a fund that had the highest returns over the last 5 years. Big surprise. And of course, in 2000, you can guess what that fund invested in. And you can also guess how it did over the next few years. So I think the lesson from that is that we experts are capable of creating sensible default investment vehicles. And Sweden's is one of the best ones. And I think the solution to many of the problems that you talk about in your report are to create more funds like that, or give people more opportunities to invest in that fund, because you can't really do any better. What's happened here in the United States is that with the growth of automatic enrollment, which is now being used in more than half of the large firms in the US, if you have automatic enrollment, you have to have a default, because if they're automatically enrolled, they have to be enrolled in something. And typically they're enrolled in a target date fund where the equity exposure starts out very high and gradually goes down. One can quibble about the particular design features, but one thing those funds do is they automatically rebalance, and they do it in a sensible way, whereas individual investors tend to buy high and sell low. So in the US, starting in 2007 and 8, investors were massively selling off equity funds and didn't start buying until 2013. So they missed the market doubling. And of course, a fund that is set to have a certain asset allocation will be buying low and selling high, which we think is a better idea than the opposite.
Right. So actually, I mean, as a piece of personal financial advice, you write in the book that you shouldn't look at your portfolio too often, right? Because when you do, you tend to do mistakes. Is that so? Or?
Yeah, no, I always recommend choosing a sensible asset allocation and then only reading the sports pages. I'm appearing on some financial news show next week as part of my book tour, and I'm trying to decide whether I should say on that show that everyone should switch off and turn on the sports network, but I'm not, maybe toward the end of my stay on that show.
Right. So you told me there was a recent reform in Israel that you have studied. I think, was that the pension reform as well?
It's a pension reform, and it was actually started by one of my students, an Israeli student, who was involved in this reform and then came here to graduate school and got the data from the reform and made it into her PhD thesis, which is pretty good. So a paper I wrote a long time ago with Shlomo Benartzi, who was another one of my former students and a co-author of the Save More Tomorrow paper, we have a theory of the so-called equity premium puzzle, which is, simply put, why is it that historically stocks have outperformed bonds by so much? So simple finance theory would say, yes, stocks would earn higher returns, but if you do the analysis in a rational world, the equity premium would be maybe 0.5%, and historically it's been 6%. So why is it so big? And we argue that it's because people look at their portfolios too often. Excuse me. So they look too often, and they are loss averse, meaning we know from lots of studies that people weigh losses about twice as heavily as gains. And so if the market is going up and down, and every time it goes down, you cognitively multiply losses by 2, then you're going to hate fluctuations. So we did some experiments. I did one with the only paper I wrote with both of my mentors, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. We compared the decisions people made as a function of how often they got to look at their portfolios. And we found the less they got to look, the more risk they took. And so the change that this student Maya got in Israel was their retirement funds are a separate category, perhaps like the funds in your pension plan we were talking about before. And at the time she intervened, if you went to look up the returns on your fund, the number you would see first is the return over the last month. And she got them to change and show the first number you would see is the return over the last year. And so they made that change, and it had 2 highly noticeable effects. One is people traded less Two, they invested more in equities. So it's a strong confirmation for our theory and a nice illustration of a nudge, because the same information was available to anyone willing to make some calculations. You could, in the previous regime, you could always look at the one-year return, but nobody would look at more than the 1 month. So I think it's a nice example of things you can do that are very mild.
So I think there is, yeah, right. So, okay, so the two lessons we have learned is the default fund in the PPM system was like we should have more funds like that. Second lesson is we shouldn't look at our bank statements too often, because the risk is that we do bad decisions. So it's better not to do. Kind of related. So I want to hear your opinion about, because I've heard this is not in today's report. But I've heard people talking about it. In order to get people away from these actively managed expensive funds to cheaper index funds. So the way the fees are charged right now, they're just taken off the capital. I mean, the capital you invested. So someone told me, I mean, what if we instead bill the customer once a year? And there's a regulation saying that you get a bill every year where you have to pay the fees for your mutual funds. So that is. Yeah, I don't know. Is that a nudge? Do you think it would be successful?
It certainly qualifies as a nudge, because you're not changing anything. This would be another supposedly irrelevant factor. You're paying exactly the same amount, but I think it's a brilliant idea. I mean, although I'm sure that the managers of funds that charge high fees would disagree. But I'm a principal in a money management firm that actively manages funds. So, but most of our business is not in mutual funds. But yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Right. And it shouldn't, I mean, it's a supposedly relevant factor. So I know in this audience, I think there are some people from the finance sector, and certainly some people that have actively managed quite expensive funds. I mean, some of them will claim that their funds are really good investments. But I guess, I mean, if people are econs, they should understand, and if that's true, that they will buy them anyway, right? Or let's move to another. So another theme in the report today was financial literacy. So a part of the report is an investigation into how financially literate Swedes are. And it turns out, not very surprisingly, and that's in line with previous research, that Swedes are highly financially literate. So they can't do simple calculations about interest and inflation, and there's many financial terminology that they don't understand. So what is your take on this? So I know also the financial supervisory authorities they are supporting a financial education and trying to undertake measures to kind of improve financial literacy. So is that the way to go, you think, or should we just accept that people are financially literate and they're not interested, and we should try to kind of help them through other ways instead?
So, I think trying to improve financial literacy is a laudable goal, but one that seems to be nearly impossible to achieve. And in fact, there's been a recent study, a meta-analysis, which just means a study that aggregates lots of other studies. And what they find is that the effects of financial literacy programs are small, and they don't last very long. And if you think of, this is intuitively right, just think about how much you remember from your high school chemistry class. Or, who in the room can still remember their trigonometry? I'm guessing there are not very many hands that are going up.
It's not a single hand, I can tell you.
No hands?
No hands at all.
No hands at all. So you know, this is a highly educated audience, and none of us remember most of what we learned in high school. So even if you had
another question on the audience here. So from your high school chemistry, should put acid in the water or water in the acid? Everybody should know this. If you do it one way, you'll have an explosion, and you will get, and if you do it the right way, you don't have that, okay? It doesn't seem like there's no hands now either, so yeah, okay.
Right.
Okay, go on. I think we have proven a point.
Okay, so my view, you know, as you know, President Obama used to teach at the University of Chicago, and I was a sometimes informal advisor to him, and he appointed a friend of mine, another Chicagoan, to head some commission on financial literacy. And at one of their meetings, they brought me in and a couple others, and I told them that their mission was futile. And so what should we do instead? You know, the British government created this so-called nudge unit, behavioral insight team. And when I'm working with them, whenever I go around, I have a mantra, which is, if you want people to do something, make it easy. And make it easy that's the answer to almost all lessons. So rather than try to, and you know, think about, not only can we not remember what we learned in high school, but think of how much you would have to know to make really good decisions. I mean, most of my economist friends are not comfortable really thinking that they know which mortgage is best. Everybody here goes and asks Doug Diamond, who's one of my finance colleagues and is the smartest guy around and knows everything. So we just go ask Doug. So, but if you're not Doug, then these problems are too hard. So what do I recommend instead? Well, one is simple defaults, like we were talking with the pension. Another is, I think one way to make choices easier is to have a set of products that are easy to compare. So take mortgages. A proposal I've written about in one of my New York Times columns is to create a class of mortgages that the government would give some label, like EZ. I don't know what the Swedish equivalent would be. But and the idea is that no one would be required to take out such a mortgage or even to issue such a mortgage. But if a firm wanted this label, then all the terms of the mortgage would be set. And it's kind of, I don't know whether you have standard form leases in Sweden, but here if you go and rent an apartment, there's a standard form that a landlord has to give you, and if they make any changes in that, they have to scratch it out and make it clear. So in these mortgages, if you want the easy label, here would all the terms be. Now notice what that does. It means we're back to a world where there's one number, it's the only number you have to look at, which is the interest rate. So if you have a 30-year fixed rate, easy mortgage, just choose the one with the lowest interest rate, you're done, because all the other terms are the same. And I think this can be done in all kinds of different environments. There's one other thing that I think is very important and relates to another question I'm sure you're going to ask me. So, and that's about disclosure. And most disclosure is about as useless as most financial education. And the reason is that it's like the instruction manuals for new software packages. I mean, no one can understand them. So how can we make disclosure better? So there's something in nudge we gave a very bad acronym for, but someone in the Obama administration came up with a better name for it, which is smart disclosure. And I've been pushing for this both in the US and the UK. And here's how it would work for mortgages. So again, I don't know how it works in Sweden, but in the US, if you apply for a mortgage, you get a big pile of forms to fill out and to sign. And there's a document that lists all these terms. And what I would like is instead, you would be handed a memory stick. And all of the terms of the mortgage would be on that memory stick in some machine-readable format. And all right, so you say, what am I going to do with that? Well, you would upload that to some website, findagoodmortgage.com, and it would look at all the terms and say, well, first of all, I wouldn't take out a mortgage that had that little thing in the fine print. And second, if this is the sort of mortgage you want, then here are 4 other ones that are cheaper. And I think we can do smart disclosure in all kinds of domains, and it will create a whole new industry of what I call choice engines. And travel websites are a good illustration of what a choice engine is. So it used to be we had to have a travel agent if we wanted to book a flight from Chicago to Stockholm. Now we all just go online and we book ourselves and we get the lowest fare. Choosing a mortgage could be just as easy as that if all the disclosure information is machine readable, and then we have a competitive market in choice engines. This makes markets efficient.
Okay, so I mean, I guess one worry I would have is whether computers are smart enough to do that for us, but perhaps they are. I don't know what the current state of the technology is. But your first example was more, I mean, if I understood you correctly, I mean, smart disclosure is basically about providing more information, but more in a transparent way and in a way that can be communicated to these services. But your first example at mortgages was having standardized packages. So if you go back to that idea, I mean, then regulators will intervene in markets quite a bit more, right? So we are essentially saying that this is the way the program should be, or? Okay.
No, I'm not saying that everyone needs to offer such a mortgage. I'm saying only that if you want that label, then you have to use these terms. And, presumably, people that are giving advice to financial novices would say, well, if you don't know what you're doing, I would recommend you pick one of these easy, because those are easy to compare. So I have a very light-handed approach. It's amusing, in the US, we're mostly criticized from the right because we're thought of as meddlers. But most of our proposals would be considered not strong enough compared to the ones that are being proposed in your report. So, of course, that makes us think we're exactly right in the middle.
Right. Right. So on that note, I mean, when I don't know if you had a look at the Swedish Financial Supervisory Authority's report, but it's clear if you look at what they are doing and what measures they have, policy measures they have taken, it's largely about providing consumers with better information. So whereas the nudge perspective goes beyond that, right? I mean, you said it before. I mean, we have to make the right choice easy to make. So that means that the financial inspection, FI, Finansinspektionen, needs to form an opinion about what's good for the consumer. And I think there's some concern about doing that, given the current mandate, which is seems to be a lot about just helping the consumers to make these active decisions. And I have the sense, I mean, I'm not really into this, but I have the sense that competition authorities often complain if you try to go beyond just providing information, because then you might implicitly favor one supplier rather than another. Is that a tension you think that is real, or is it some way we could go around that?
Well, I mean, I think it's a real tension, and I think it is. I think it's right to question in some circumstances whether the regulators have the knowledge to do this. In some domains, it's clear that the answer is no. Obviously, financial regulators failed miserably during the financial crisis, and so did agencies, and partly because it's hard for governments and rating agencies to compete with hedge funds and investment banks for talent. And so I think that's a problem. That's why I tend to stress this smart disclosure idea instead, and then create a market for advice. Now, you're right that the advice would only be as good as the people writing those programs, but I don't know about you, but I find when I book a ticket on a travel website, I usually get where I'm going, and it's pretty easy to sort out which hotel I want to stay in if I'm coming to visit Stockholm, and get a suit. I can find the efficient frontier, as we economists would call it, and I think we can do that in lots of other domains. A good example is GPS. This was government had data, and they made it available to the private sector, and now we all have GPS in our phone. And if the government makes other data available, then other entrepreneurs will put other stuff on our phones.
Great. Thank you so much for this discussion. I think it was very enlightening and interesting, and I should leave the floor to Willie for a few last words, but thank you a lot, Richard Taylor. And
a big applause.
Big applause.
Får jag bara fråga dig, Robert, var det någonting som stack ut här, något oväntat?
Nej, det kan jag väl inte säga att det var. Och det här med smart disclosure har inte jag själv tänkt på så mycket, och det är lite svårt att föreställa sig hur det skulle kunna bli eller hur det skulle kunna funka. Liksom, och om den här marknaden skulle uppstå, sen så kan man ju lätt fantisera ihop sett hur företag skulle försöka lura de här jämförelsesajterna som skulle försöka hjälpa oss med de här valen.
En sista fråga bara, men mycket av det han pratar om, tror att det kommer att bli verklighet? Det här var ju lite...
Alltså, han har ju föreslagit många saker förut som sprids över världen väldigt snabbt. Så jag vet inte. Det är väl svårt jag tycker det är svårt att säga. Och det här med, som sagt, med smart disclosure tyckte jag var lite... Det var svårt att veta om det kommer funka eller inte. Men det är väl någonting att ta med sig.
Kom ihåg var ni hörde det först. Stort tack till dig, Robert, för att du ledde det här samtalet. Tack så mycket. Och med detta sagt så är denna dag slut. Stort tack för att ni kom hit. Tack så mycket.